Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Balance Provider webinar, Evidence Over Influence, Navigating Gut Diet Trends in Your Practice. I'm Alina Sheikh, and I'll be moderating today's session and introducing our hosts, who will present their slides and lead our Q&A at the end of the session. Now, before we dive in, let me tell you a bit about Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Center. We've been at the forefront of eating disorder treatment and body image recovery for over 15 years. In our work, we constantly see the impact the diet trends, especially those targeting gut health, can have on our clients' relationship with food and their bodies. That's why today's conversation is so important. Now, today, we are incredibly fortunate to have Tamara Duker Freuman joining us. Tamara is the author of The Bloated Belly Whisperer and Regular, specializing in decoding the causes of digestive distress. What sets Tamara apart is her approach. No dogma, no one size fits all, just pattern recognition, root cause investigation, and solutions tailored to what's actually happening in your body. Your gut is personal, and Tamara's mission is to provide understanding, empathy, practical solutions, and evidence-based care. We're thrilled to have her expertise with us today. Now, let me introduce Balance Eating Disorder Treatment Center founder and CEO, Melainie Rogers. We're thrilled to have her moderating this discussion with us. As an eating disorder specialist, dietitian, NYU professor, and IDEP mentor, she provides guidance to clinicians in redefining recovery. Having navigated her own lived experience, she has dedicated more than 25 years of her career to supporting others' recovery journeys. I'll leave it off to her now to give a warm welcome to everyone here and to kick off tomorrow's slides moving forward.
Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you joining us today for what I know to be a really fabulous presentation from Tamara Duker Freuman. Tamara and I have known each other for a few years, actually, more than I would like to count. Amazing, amazing RD who specializes in GI and eating disorders. And we've certainly consulted with Tamara over the years and really, really appreciate her incredible work. So Tamara is a New York City-based dietitian. She's an author of the two books that you just heard about. Regular is her brand new book. I love the toilet roll on the front page. She is a US News and World Report contributor, specializing in digestion, and she really debunks gut myths, provides evidence-based GI nutrition to thousands, as well as in her private practice. So really thrilled to have you here with us today, Tamara.
Thanks, Melainie.
So let's jump in.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so I, as usual, on brand for myself, put about double the amount of content I have time for. So I already talk fast, and I'm going to talk even faster. So hopefully you will follow, and it won't feel like you're drinking from a fire hose. We're going to start just by kind of talking, like laying some groundwork around definitions. What do we mean by, gut health, inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, and then we'll kind of move into, based on the science, sort of what does that mean as far as what diets are and are not gut friendly and anti-inflammatory, and go from there. Just some quick definitions. This I completely stole from our amazing, talented colleague, Kate Scarlatta, who really, I think, captures what I think of when we think of gut health, which is really a three-pronged definition. A healthy gut can effectively digest and absorb nutrients. It doesn't have any active disease like, inflammatory bowel disease, ulcers, degradation, and a favorable balance of gut microbiota, which, is not a very easy, obvious thing to define. There's so much science around that. I could literally do a whole webinar on just what even a favorable balance is, but we know what a very unfavorable balance is. And there's some ratios and some basic definitions that go into that. So that's what a healthy gut really is. We hear people talk about inflammation a lot, and I think it's worth taking a moment to actually define it. So inflammation overall is your body's response to bad things, to pathogens, to damage, and inflammation is actually in the service of a healing response. And so we kind of think about inflammation as, it can be acute and it can be chronic. And those look and behave really differently in the body. Next slide. I think we all probably recognize acute inflammation. This is sort of, a very obvious, very rapid onset response to maybe an injury or to a virus or to a food poisoning GI bug, where there's some sort of injury to a tissue or a cell, based on a pathogen or a physical barrier disruption. And the damaged cells start releasing these chemical signalers that tell your immune system, hey, there's something bad going on here. I need some help. The signaling chemicals allow the blood vessels to get permeable so that the white blood cells can actually get out of the blood vessels to the site of the injury. And then when the white blood cells get to the place of injury, they start to either eat up the bacteria or kind of eat up some dead cells. And that allows for the tissue to be healed. We know what acute inflammation looks and feels like because as the blood cells get leaky and as those white blood cells migrate, we might feel and see swelling. We might feel some heat, see some redness, right? Those are the signs of acute inflammation. I think we're all pretty familiar with what that looks like. Next slide. Chronic inflammation is different. Chronic inflammation, if acute inflammation is a bonfire, chronic inflammation is kind of like a low grade smoldering, of like the embers as the fire is kind of put out, but isn't quite 100% put out. And this is sort of ongoing immune system activation long after that initial insult or injury has transpired. And so this chronic, low grade, but persistent inflammation can still damage tissues and cells over time. The inflammation can cause oxidative stress. This damages cell membranes and can kind of create these DNA mutations or other types of damage. I think in the GI tract, chronic inflammation is something that is more obvious and intuitively understood. Often anything that ends with itis, represents chronic inflammation in the gut. Gastritis, chronic inflammation of the stomach. Over time, gastritis is a risk factor for stomach cancer. Esophagitis, inflammation of the esophagus. That can be a risk factor for esophageal cancer. Colitis, inflammation of the colon cancer risk, right? So in the GI tract, inflammation is somewhat more, chronic inflammation is somewhat more perceptible. Often it's very symptomatic, and we know sort of like it can lead to cancers. But there are other diseases, especially metabolic disease, that we don't always think of as inflammatory diseases or diseases of chronic inflammation, but they absolutely are. I think atherosclerosis is a really interesting one. We don't think of sort of plaque buildup in the arteries as a disease of chronic inflammation, but actually when you start to really look into the pathogenesis of it, it absolutely is a disease of chronic inflammation. Similarly to like chronic liver disease, fatty liver, type 2 diabetes, all of these do have a chronic inflammatory component to them. Okay, so understanding what chronic inflammation is, how do we measure it? The answer is there's not just one way. There are a lot of ways that inflammation can be measured. And so the way that you would really measure inflammation kind of depends what you're looking for. There's no way to be like, you can't just go to a doctor and say, do I have inflammation or not? Yes or no, right? You really need to be looking for something specific and testing for specific things in order to detect specific types of inflammation. And many of the inflammatory markers are also non-specific. So for example, you might have a blood work that shows an elevated level of CRP, C-reactive protein. That indicates that there's inflammation going on somewhere, but it doesn't tell us specifically where and what the inflammation is. And so now we do know that there are some specific certain diseases that correlate with certain inflammatory markers. So for example, if your doctor is trying to evaluate whether you could have inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's or colitis, they would check a stool marker called fecal calprotectin. Calprotectin is actually pretty specific to gut inflammation. Okay. But then, like I said, there are some other very non-specific markers of inflammation, high ferritin, high CRP. These things can indicate inflammation somewhere, but not always. Certain cancers might be associated with very specific markers. And so there are a lot of different ways that a doctor would measure inflammation. Again, it's not a yes or no answer. A lot of it is really having a hypothesis, what type of inflammation or what kind of disease am I looking for, and then trying to see if there is an inflammatory marker that we know correlates with it. I have a couple of these highlighted in yellow. These are going to become relevant in a few slides when we start talking about the dietary inflammatory index. So these are just some examples of inflammation markers that a doctor might use to identify inflammation somewhere in the body. We are not going to talk about this slide in great detail. This is a summary slide. I'm going to talk about these two separate things later on in the presentation, but I want to kind of lay some groundwork, which is when we think about diets and how do we evaluate whether a diet is sort of pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory, what is the type of science that, we can bring to bear to answer these questions? We have a lot of different methods of scientific inquiry and we triangulate them. So we can look from the bottom up, which I'm going to talk about one such bottom-up investigation or tool called the Dietary Inflammatory Index. But we also have these sort of top-down investigations, which I'm going to talk about later on, where we kind of look at very, very large, like large data sets and populations and kind of drill down and to kind of understand at a high level, how can we account for some really good health outcomes that we're just seeing happen naturally in the world. And so there's very robust, large scientific literatures that we draw on to answer the questions about what diets are anti or pro-inflammatory. And there are a lot of data. This is a very, very strong, rich research literature. This is not tentative, early science. So let's start with one bottom-up approach. I want to introduce you to the Dietary Inflammatory Index, the DII. The DII is one validated index that researchers use to evaluate a diet's quality, specifically vis-a-vis whether the diet is associated with a pro-inflammatory effect or an anti-inflammatory effect. It is not the only one. This is not the only index we have in the research literature to evaluate diet quality, but this one is very specific to inflammation. Other indices you might have come across if you ever do read sort of scientific literature is the healthy eating index, the HEI, the alternate healthy eating index, the AHEI. Maybe you've come across the planetary health dietary index. Like there are these other dietary indices that are used for diet quality. This one is very specific to inflammation. And really what it is this is a group of researchers who looked at 1,900 studies where somebody looked at one of the inflammation markers that I showed in a previous slide. And so some of the ones that were highlighted in yellow were among the 6 that were investigated to derive this index. So anyone who studied any kind of food parameter vis-a-vis an objectively measurable inflammatory biomarker was part of this data set. Okay. And so they look at these 1,900 studies and looking at 34 parameters. I'll show you in a moment what those were. And based on the number of studies, the strength of the studies per parameter, they came up with a system, a rubric, if you will, to score these dietary compounds to give them a number as to whether they were kind of neutral, more pro-inflammatory, or more anti-inflammatory. Okay, and the range is -1, which is maximally anti-inflammatory. So if there was a food that had a -1, that would be like super duper extra anti-inflammatory. If there was a food that had a score of 1, it would be super duper pro-inflammatory. The closer you are to 0, the more neutral you are. Maybe like -0.1 is mildly anti-inflammatory, right? +0.1 is modestly pro-inflammatory. And that's kind of how the index works. And then what you can do is once every food parameter has sort of a number or an objective score, you can look at somebody's whole diet and see how many servings a week do I eat of, say, ginger or, of saturated fat or, of, beta carotene or all these things that we know that they have scores and build up and look at a whole diet and give the whole diet a larger score as to whether the diet is generally pro or anti-inflammatory. So at the diet level, a super duper maximally anti-inflammatory diet would have a score of -9, and a super duper pro-inflammatory diet would have a score of +8. A pretty neutral diet would be a 0. Does that make sense? Or a little bit more than it, I guess a little bit less than a 0. Does that make sense? So what are the raw data in the DII? Oh my God, this is a crazy slide. We're not really going to talk about it except to say these are 34 food parameters that the researchers found somebody had studied vis-a-vis a biomarker of inflammation. And what you see in that first column is how many articles have studied this. So on the way, way, way bottom, we have rosemary. Okay, only 9 studies have even ever looked at rosemary and tried to correlate it to an inflammatory marker. But then you look at something like polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA, by the way, which seed oils contain PUFAs. We have 4,000 studies that have studied the relationship between PUFAs and an inflammatory marker. That is a huge number of studies. And so you can kind of see just on the basis of this slide, what food components or dietary components have been really, really well studied and what have been only modestly studied. But when it comes to fatty acids, we actually have a ton of research data to draw from that these scoring systems have been derived on, which is to say, we have a lot of data on whether or not these foods are pro or anti-inflammatory. Next slide. I'm going to give you some highlights about what the DII shows. Okay, so here's some scores of some of the parameters that the DII has looked at, starting with flavonoids, which are sort of like these plant chemicals, like plant compounds. You've probably heard of some of these. Flavones are kind of in, I think that's like an echinacea tea and in some of the herbs and capsaicin. Isoflavones, hopefully we've all heard of. Soy isoflavones, you probably know some of them by name. There's the genistein and the dadezyne, or the soy isoflavones. We also have isoflavones in regular beans and legumes as well. Flavonols, you probably know quercetin is a pretty famous flavanol that's in, apple skins and onion and red onions. Flavonols, we all know those pretty well. That's the resveratrol in red wine. It's the catechins in green tea. It's the cocoa polyphenols that make, dark chocolate so good for our blood vessels. And you can see these all have like pretty good negative numbers, right? Remember, -1 is maximally anti-inflammatory. We've got a -0.6. We've got, a -0.46, a -0.4. Like these are pretty darn anti-inflammatory food compounds. Next slide. We have these other vitamins that we know of as antioxidants, and these are also incredibly anti-inflammatory, right? Beta carotene, which is in all of our orange vegetables and fruits and the dark leafy greens, has a very strong anti-inflammatory score of -0.58. Vitamin E is very anti-inflammatory as well. Vitamin E is in nuts and seeds and wheat germ oil, and also seed oils, including soybean oil. Don't shoot the messenger. It's true. Soybean oil is a really strong source of vitamin E, even when it's refined. Vitamin C is obviously very strong anti-inflammatory score as well, -0.4, which you see what foods are in vitamin C, and I think we all know that as dietitians. Unsaturated fats. Omega-3s have a stronger anti-inflammatory score than omega-6s, but as you can see, omega-6s are still on the negative side, which means that they are still mildly anti-inflammatory. Omega-3s, we know fatty fish, chia, flax seeds, walnuts. Also, canola oil has a precursor to omega-3s. It has the ALA, alpha linolenic acid, which can be converted into EPA DHA. And then we have omega-6s, which are in nuts and seeds, and yes, in seed oils as well. Those have a mildly anti-inflammatory score on the DII on the basis of something like, I don't know what it was, 700 studies or something like that from the previous slide. So a lot of data on those. Next slide. We'll come back to seed oils later, I promise. I have a whole slide on them. Herbs and spices, super anti-inflammatory. Curcumin actually has the strongest anti-inflammatory score in the entire DII, -0.785. That is the most anti-inflammatory compound that the DII captures. Ginger is also very anti-inflammatory. And eugenol, which is in cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg is also. And so again, like herbs and spices generally are part of a really robust anti-inflammatory diet. Fiber, very strongly anti-inflammatory. Again, one of the most anti-inflammatory things on the index. We know at least one of the mechanisms by which fiber has an anti-inflammatory effect, which is how it nourishes the gut microbiome. When certain members of the microbiome nosh on fiber, they produce these very anti-inflammatory compounds called short-chain fatty acids, right? Butyrate and the like. And fiber from all sorts of sources, fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, collectively extremely anti-inflammatory. And so high fiber diets, unsurprisingly, are associated with lots of very good things. And this is one of the reasons why, of course, high fiber foods also have other anti-inflammatory compounds like isoflavones and beta carotene and vitamins. And so these foods deliver a lot of different mechanisms of anti-inflammation, but fiber alone is very anti-inflammatory. Next slide. Okay, and then we get into some of the few things in the DII that actually have positive scores, which means that they are pro-inflammatory. Saturated fat, which is found in red meats, it's in milk fat, and yes, coconut oil, the venerated coconut oil that has the best marketing team in the whole wide world. Trans fats are pro-inflammatory. Again, we don't really have these much in the American food supply anymore just because we have learned just how potentially harmful they are. And so they've really been taken out of the food supply. But I do want to highlight here that a lot of the data that the seed oil smear campaigns are based on come from decades ago when people were being told to switch from animal fat to margarine. And decades ago, what did we have in margarine? Trans fats. And so now that we understand how harmful trans fats are, we can understand how maybe a lot of the early data that has been used to kind of malign vegetable oils probably had a confounding factor there, which is the type of vegetable oils that were being used that these studies were based on were partially hydrogenated or trans fats, and very different than, the new margarines that, that are available now and just straight up seed oils that have no hydrogenation at all. So that's also something to bear in mind, I think. And cholesterol is also mildly pro-inflammatory, which, is found in organ meats and egg yolks, etc. Basically, now that you understand that all these different dietary parameters can have either a pro, a neutral, or an anti-inflammatory score, what researchers can do is they can kind of take a real diet or even like a sample diet and kind of say like, okay, for breakfast they eat like this portion of that food and this portion of that food, and here's a typical lunch and typical dinner, and start to build up the portions and the numbers and the types of foods in an overall diet, and then score the overall diet by adding up, the compounds or the DII scored compounds in that diet. And so this is just an example of one study that kind of gave a sample of how would a typical fast food diet score, a typical Mediterranean diet, a typical macrobiotic diet, right? And so they kind of made these typical meals and they gave them like point values according to the DII, and they come up with a scoring system. So the fast food diet in this study had like a +4, which is, pro-inflammatory. Remember, the maximum pro-inflammatory diet score would be 8. A Mediterranean diet got a -3.96, basically a -4, which is, anti-inflammatory. And the macrobiotic scored even better than the Mediterranean diet as far as being anti-inflammatory. But you can see so then how a researcher might use this index when they have a big set of people and they're studying diets to really assess whether somebody is following a pro or an anti-inflammatory diet, right? And so this is a tool that they use that has been used in a lot of research and has been validated in a lot of large data sets ranging from breast cancer and colon cancer to type 2 diabetes, to really show these strong correlations between how anti or pro-inflammatory somebody's diet is versus various types of health outcomes. So that's pretty much how the DII turns into evaluation of an overall diet quality. So the DII is an example of a bottom-up approach where we kind of take a food component and then link it to typical food habits, and then link typical food habits to an overall diet, and then link that diet score to health outcomes. That is a very bottoms-up approach. But there's another way that we evaluate diet quality, and which is the top-down approach, which is researchers will look at a population of people, maybe, people who live to age 100 or higher with very low rates of disease, right? In like, Crete or something. Or we'll look at people who have really low rates of breast cancer or super low rates of cardiometabolic disease. And then the researchers will say, okay, here's a population that's doing really, really well health-wise. What are they eating? What do their diets look like? Right? And then what they'll either do is, try to replicate that diet in an actual study and say, let's give a group of, average Americans this diet and follow them and see what happens. Or they might say, hey, let's make a hypothesis around a very specific thing about that diet that we think is really driving it. Maybe at the Mediterranean diet, it's like we think high olive oil intake is super beneficial. So we're not even gonna, make people have a whole Mediterranean diet, but we want to see whether olive oil or olive oil intake in general correlates to health outcomes in a data set we already have. So let's take our nurses' health study that has 200,000 people, and let's filter it based on olive oil intake. And let's see, do people who eat more olive oil have any different health outcomes than people who eat less olive oil? So this is a top-down approach where you can either replicate something that someone else is doing as an intervention study, or just take a hypothesis around a certain food component or components and then use it as a filter to look at your already data sets, NHANES data, nurses' health data, the Framingham, men's heart study, and just kind of road test or pressure test some of these hypotheses to see if we can learn about whether, or validate whether certain dietary components do indeed correlate with certain health outcomes for better or for worse. And that's really what a top-down approach would look like. And again, when it comes to anti-inflammatory diets, we have data from both bottom-up approaches, and we also have a ton of data from these top-down approaches. And so I'm going to take you through some of what we know from the top-down approach as well. Next slide. So based on all the data we have, both from bottom-up learning and top-down learning, what does science tell us is an evidence-based anti-inflammatory diet? So on the left of this slide, I think is a pretty good summary of what we have really, really good data to support. And I want to kind of compare that to the right side, which is if you spent, 6 hours on Instagram and you were an alien from another country and you didn't know anything about how humans eat and said, okay, well, I'm going to just search all the healthy hashtags on Instagram or TikTok and try to make a guess about what a healthy diet is. If that's my only data source, what would I learn? And I think that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of divergence. And so, the science tells us that, plant proteins are anti-inflammatory, diets high in plant proteins are anti-inflammatory. I think generally speaking, the social media world validates that as well. We hear a lot about plant-based protein, although there is, in the online or in influencer community, a lot of people don't love soy. And objectively speaking, soy is actually quite anti-inflammatory. High soy intake correlates very strongly to lower breast cancer risk. I think Japanese women have among the lowest risks of breast cancer in the world and some of the highest soy intake in the world. So I think that influencers get soy wrong. As far as evidence tells us, lots of antioxidant rich fruits and vegetables are anti-inflammatory. I think that the influencer world absolutely generally supports that finding, but they really kind of market the superfood aspect of it. In other words, I think some fruits and vegetables seem more equal than others, or kind of given these like supernatural powers in a way that the science doesn't necessarily support. You don't have to eat kale to be healthy. Like I personally do not like kale at all. And, I don't think that you have to eat those very specific foods, although certainly, there are some foods that do seem to be cornerstone foods of very healthy diets. I think when we kind of get into dietary patterns in a moment, we'll see that berries actually do seem to be like a linchpin of the mind diet, specifically for preventing cognitive decline. And so there's not like no evidence of superfoods. I think olive oil also is kind of like a real, the Mediterranean diet without olive oil isn't quite as powerful. And so there's a germ of an idea with superfoods. I think it's a little bit over marketed. Fiber, super anti-inflammatory from an evidence-based perspective. Again, we do see the same emphasis on fiber in the influencer community, but we see a lot of marketing of sort of isolated fiber supplements, especially prebiotic fiber supplements, inulin, prebiotic sodas, and adding, fiber to a lot of, like low carb things. We don't have good data to support whether that's actually a good thing or not. And it's actually somewhat controversial in the people who study inulin, as specifically the ingredient inulin, which is a very common prebiotic fiber, whether it's actually anti-inflammatory for everyone. There is some concerning data that supplementing inulin at high levels to people who already have a messed up gut microbiome might actually be fueling the wrong critters. In other words, actually fueling inflammation, because inulin feeds bacteria, period. If you don't have great bacteria, you're feeding the inflammatory bacteria. And so it's not a given that supplementing prebiotic fibers is necessarily a great thing for everyone. And certainly we don't have good data to support that we all should be doing that. Science tells us that unsaturated fats from nuts and seeds and fish and avocado, both monounsaturated and polyunsaturated, are super anti-inflammatory. I think the internet feels much better about nuts and seeds and fish than it does seed oils, and that's a newer trend. We'll talk about seed oils more specifically in another slide. Science tells us that saturated fats in general are more pro-inflammatory, and that would include, animal fat from whole milk dairy and red meat and butter and coconut oil. The influencers freaking love ghee and coconut oil. I don't like, the science doesn't support that. Those are not healthy oils from a science perspective. Those are not anti-inflammatory from an evidence-based perspective. Science tells us herbs, spices, coffee, tea, chocolate, right? All of those polyphenols, all those isoflavones and flavonoids, same thing in the influencer community. But again, there's a lot of emphasis on sort of like these superfoods, like you need to take ginger turmeric shots or do like mushroom extract powders and greens powders, where really the data are much more focused on whole food sources. We don't have any data as to whether powders have the same impact on health as eating greens. We don't have any data as to whether mushroom extracts are as healthful as eating mushrooms. And so a lot of that is very speculative. An anti-inflammatory diet from a evidence-based perspective would be very low in red meat and processed meats. I think in the influencer community, uh, a lot of like the paleo kind of diets really do emphasize, grass-fed, pasture-raised, but still are very, often quite liberal with red meat in a way that the evidence would not necessarily support. And then, low added sugar would be an evidence-based anti-inflammatory diet. The World Health Organization says less than 5% of calories. The American Heart Association says, between 5 and 10% would be a good kind of limit. I think in the influencer community often takes a very hard line around, sugar-free, like no added sugar, or sometimes they kind of really parse it between refined sugar and unrefined sugar. Added sugar is added sugar from your health perspective, whether it's refined or not refined. Metabolically, it doesn't actually make a huge difference. And so it's really the amount rather than the source, at least from an evidence-based perspective. So those are kind of a comparison. So a lot of overlap. It's not the internet gets everything wrong. The influencers don't get everything wrong, but I think that they get some very important things very wrong. These are just some examples of anti-inflammatory diet patterns. There are many, many, many anti-inflammatory diets. There's not one single anti-inflammatory diet. We all have heard of the Mediterranean diet. I think Andrew Weil has a really interesting one that I kind of like. It just emphasizes some very specific foods that I think are great. And he emphasizes a lot of like specifically whole soy foods or like get their own little rung in the pyramid, which I think is terrific. He also calls out herbs and spices in a way that the Mediterranean diet is just doesn't really talk about, which I think is pretty terrific since we know how anti-inflammatory herbs and spices are. And he specifically talks about tea and green tea, which again, I like that this pyramid really kind of calls out some of the most anti-inflammatory foods and compounds that the DII really does speak to. And so I think it's a really kind of interesting pyramid. Next slide. The mind diet, especially if you are at risk for developing cognitive decline or dementia. I mean, I certainly have a relative, and so it's very much on my mind. The mind diet is basically a version of the Mediterranean diet that really is very prescriptive about how many times a week you should be eating certain foods. The Mediterranean diet doesn't really say eat this food 3 times a week and this food twice a week. It just says eat a lot of these foods. The mind diet is like, hey, you should be eating berries twice a week, specifically to prevent cognitive decline and dementia. You should be eating dark leafy greens like every day. And so the mind diet is an offshoot of the med diet, but it emphasizes berries specifically. It's a little bit less liberal with alcohol than the Mediterranean diet is. And like I said, it's very prescriptive about numbers of servings per week. And then we have the Asian diet pyramid. And, within the Asian diet pyramid, there's also different versions of different types of Asian diets, but you can envision a very anti-inflammatory Chinese diet, a very anti-inflammatory South Asian diet, again, just emphasizing a lot of the nutrient dense foods, the herbs, the spices, and, minimal saturated fat. What about ultra processed foods? So first of all, the DII was developed before we had a lot of the data on ultra high processed foods. And so this category is not included in the DII. So let's start there. How do we define ultra high processed foods? There is the NOVA classification system. If you're not familiar with it, this is published research. And I have a reference on my reference slide if you want to learn more about sort of what would constitute ultra high processed foods. But in this picture, you can see it's things like frozen pizzas and frozen meals and hot dogs and processed meats and fast food, defined basically as manufactured foods that have undergone extensive processing and have a lot of ingredients that would not be commonly used in home cooking, such as preservatives, gums, emulsifiers, artificial sweeteners, colors, flavors, lots of added sugar, things like that. And we do have, a significant and growing, this is a huge area of research right now, around links or associations between higher intake of ultra processed foods and various bad health outcomes, including just general mortality, inflammatory bowel disease, dementia, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers. So we do see, and we're seeing more and more that like people who eat more ultra processed foods generally are going to be at an elevated risk of, not great health outcomes. However, does that mean that eating any ultra high processed food is like gonna send you into like a, an inflammatory burst of flames? No. There's actually some really interesting germs of data that are coming out in these studies that are suggesting what a scientific definition of moderation is. In other words, when someone has a very high quality diet, and the first study I'm going to refer to is huge, 114,000 people followed for a very long period of time. When someone has a very high quality diet, in this case, this study looked at the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, a high score on that diet. What we see is that the usual correlation between ultra processed food intake and mortality basically disappears as long as the overall diet quality is high. In other words, if you eat a really good diet, lots of fruits and vegetables and beans and not a lot of saturated fat, and you have, a few favorite fun foods that you eat pretty consistently, in the context of a generally really high diet quality, we don't see the same associations with mortality as we see among people who eat those foods and don't have a high diet quality. So, in other words, a really good diet does attenuate the impact of some ongoing regular processed food intake. We also are seeing this connection in the context of dementia. So, this was a study out of Brazil, 11,000 people, which is still a very large study. And they were also looking at the relationship between ultra processed food intake and the risk of developing dementia. And for sure, they saw a connection, right? Like, yes, people who eat a lot of processed foods were at higher risk for developing dementia. But there seemed to be a cutoff point around 20% of calories. In other words, as long as the ultra processed foods were less than 20% of overall calories, they did not see an association between ultra processed food and risk of cognitive decline. In other words, there is the 80-20 rule, at least when it comes to dementia, that seems to hold. And so when I think about a dietitian, and as a dietitian, how do I counsel people on ultra processed foods? What might I say to them? I might say, look, these are not, superfood cancer fighting foods, right? And if your diet quality is really high and there's a couple of these foods that you really enjoy and have a hard time like and want to include in your diet, as long as they're not more than 20% of your calories, that's probably okay, at least based on the available science we have. They seem not to be doing harm, at least when it comes to mortality risk and dementia risk. Again, those are two very specific things. Maybe it might be different for Crohn's disease. Maybe it might be different for a certain cancer. We don't know yet. This is newer data. But so far, there's a really good argument to be made for moderation when it comes to these things rather than all or nothing, black or white thinking. Last real thing, and then we'll go into the Q&A, evidence versus influence. So how does this really play out in the real world? We have a lot of these trendy diets that are claiming that they're gut healthy or anti-inflammatory. And many of these diets, in fact, all of these diets actually restrict a lot of objectively anti-inflammatory foods. And some of them encourage higher intake of foods that are known to be pro-inflammatory. I think the Whole30 is probably the least offensive in this regard. They don't really encourage pro-inflammatory foods, but they do absolutely restrict some of the most anti-inflammatory foods, especially beans. I think any diet that tells you to avoid beans is automatically disqualified. Beans are literally like the one food that has been linked directly to longevity. So any diet that tells you beans are inflammatory is, operating from a non-scientific place. And so I think the Whole30 does itself a disservice by telling people to avoid some very anti-inflammatory foods. And frankly, if you're eating less of those foods, you may end up eating more red meat and pro-inflammatory foods, although that's not a given. I think the AIP, the autoimmune paleo, which is marketed as an anti-inflammatory diet for people with chronic, autoimmune diseases, I think it gets it completely wrong. It restricts, the core of what we know to be anti-inflammatory foods, and encourages very high intake of organ meat, red meat, coconut oil, like the most saturated fat, high cholesterol things, which are some of the few pro-inflammatory foods on the index. And so I think that the AIP, from an evidence-based perspective, gets it all wrong. I mean, the carnivore diet, don't even get me started. I mean, if you would score the carnivore diet, and score it up like that study did, I mean, the score would probably be like, positive 7.999. It restricts every single anti-inflammatory food in the world and only allows you to eat The only anti-inflammatory food on a carnivore diet would be fish. Everything else that is anti-inflammatory, it restricts. Next slide. Keto diet, same thing. It's cutting out, the core, the whole core of an anti-inflammatory diet, all fruit, beans, legumes, whole grains, all those orange, starchy vegetables with the beta carotene in it. And it's encouraging a lot of, high saturated fat and high cholesterol foods. The plant paradox is that lectin, the anti-lectin craziness. Again, it restricts a lot of very anti-inflammatory foods, brown rice and squashes and all the nightshades, and it like actively encourages people to eat like 4 egg yolks a day, 4 ounces of red meat a day, heavy cream. I mean, it does not fly with the science. The GAPS diet, very similar. It really cuts out entire categories of, sort of the anti-inflammatory carbohydrates, and kind of encourages a lot of meat and saturated fat. Seed oils. Okay, we're running out of time. We've all heard the claims about seed oils that omega-6s promote inflammation, that they're toxic, maybe just of themselves or because they're, refined with hexane, and stripped of all their nutrients. And you might have heard the term the hateful eight, and somehow that ghee and coconut oil, which are all saturated fat, are healthier alternatives because they're less processed. There is so much evidence to the contrary. I mean, when I say that the seed oil, like witch hunt is like the most egregious case of medical gaslighting or influencer gaslighting that exists in the literature, I don't think that that's an exaggeration. The data are not even equivocal, and it's not even close. The data are so overwhelmingly positive in terms of omega-6s and seed oils specifically as conferring a benefit. The most recent study we have is from Zhang 2025, so like literally just published, 211,000 participants. This is from both Nurses Health Studies, 33 years of follow-up with over 200,000 participants. And they compared higher butter intake compared to higher seed oil intake, or plant oil intake, not just seed oils, all plant oils. And what they found is the people with the highest intake of plant oils had a 16% lower mortality risk compared to people who had the lowest intake of plant oils, whereas the people with the highest intake of butter had a 15% increased mortality risk over the 33 years compared to people with the lowest intake of butter. So this is a head-to-head comparison of a saturated fat and, unsaturated fats, both mono and polyunsaturated. It wasn't just olive oil or just seed oils, it was both. So that was a really large, really strong study. There's also been many review studies that have looked at dozens of studies. The Markland study in 2019 on this slide pulled the data from 30 prospective trials that included 68,000 participants. And they found that people with higher levels of linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 in their blood, was associated with lower risk of major cardiovascular events, heart attacks, strokes, things like that. And finding that those results supported a favorable role for omega-6s or linoleic acid in the diet. There was Harris, which was a slightly older study from 2009, again aggregated. I want to say, I don't know how many trials it was, I'll have to look back and see, aggregated multiple randomized control trials and case controls and cohort studies. And again, came to a very similar conclusion and recommending that between 5 to 10% of your energy should come from omega-6s if you want to reduce the risk of coronary heart disease. So the data are really strong, that higher intake of omega-6 is actually correlated with lower risk of mortality overall, as well as heart disease. And so what are the concerns then when it comes to seed oils? Are there none? The concerns really pertain to deep frying. So when you deep fry with seed oils, it can and does produce some toxins, especially when the oils are not changed regularly. And those can be disease promoting. And so I think that when it comes to seed oils, the science would support eating a lot less fried food or food fried in seed oils, which I think in general, I would probably say the same would pertain for foods fried in saturated fats as well. There's really no evidence that there's much, if any, residual hexane in refined seed oils, but even if there were some, when you cook it, it's, heat volatile, so it would disappear. And if that still wasn't satisfying enough, buy organic, because organic seed oils wouldn't use hexane anyway. So, I think that that's a very easily refutable point. And when you refine seed oils, it doesn't completely strip them of all the antioxidants. Vitamin E actually remains in refined um, soybean oil, and a lot of the oil manufacturers will add back vitamin E to the seed oils that it was stripped from, so that it doesn't spoil, because vitamin E is an antioxidant. So those seed oils actually do retain vitamin E, which we know is an antioxidant. Next slide. Okay, and this is just for reference, just different common fats and oils and their various content. As you can see, the PUFAs, or the unsaturated fats, are the blue lines, and so the oils that have the highest blue lines are the ones that are highest in polyunsaturated fats, like omega-6s, mono and omega-3s. Obviously, monounsaturated fats would be things more like canola oil has a lot of that, and olive oil as well. And then the saturated fats are the ones with the high red lines, and those are the ones that would probably be more inflammatory and less heart healthy. That's your coconut oils, your palm oils, etc., butter. I was in San Francisco this weekend, and I had to get breakfast at the airport, and I saw this and I was like, oh, this is going in the presentation. This was a place that I got my breakfast from that is claiming to have meals centered around nutritious veggies, healthy fats, and mindful proteins. The healthy fats were seed oil free, and what did they use as their healthy fat? Palm oil. So I would not consider this to be a true claim around healthy fats. I think by swapping out seed oil and replacing it with palm oil is literally the exact opposite of what an evidence-based anti-inflammatory cuisine would do. When we think of who should be our influencers, it's not the 20-year-olds on TikTok who do before and after pictures that look exactly the same. It's not people who have not lived long enough to even have a health challenge. The true influencers, at least in the science, are people who have actually lived to age 70, 80, 90, and 100 without cancer, without heart disease, with extremely low rates of chronic disease that come with age, in general. These are the true influencers, and this is who science uses to learn how we should be influencing our diets and our health habits. The influencers are old people. The influencers are healthy old people, not skinny young people. Key takeaways, we already told you, health influencers, think about old rather than young, think about healthy old. A lot of the purportedly anti-inflammatory diets or gut health diets really are fly in the face or at odds with what science tells us are anti-inflammatory diets and gut healthy diets. We have very robust scientific methods to learn what is pro and anti-inflammatory, and the research literature is large and it supports each other. It's not particularly controversial. A lot of the dietary demons that fad diets single out are not. The dietary demons are also very faddish, and they change from year to year, just based on, the social media news cycle. There are many, many versions of an anti-inflammatory diet. We all don't have to eat the same version of one, but there's certain characteristics rather than, specific diets. And when it comes to sort of even some of the more pro-inflammatory foods, whether it's, dairy fat or ultra-processed foods, it's not like you have to completely cut them out of your diet in order to have an anti-inflammatory diet. Remember, your anti-inflammatory diet is a sum total of everything you eat. If those foods are less than 20% of what you eat overall, you are probably fine, right? I am not giving up my cheese. Sorry. But it is not more than 20% of my calories. Generally speaking, more diverse plant-centric diets tend to be more anti-inflammatory. And I think that's all. And I think I made it in time, and I feel very proud of myself. Yay.
You
Yes.
absolutely should. Tamara, I was taking so many notes there. You answered so many of my questions and such, and did such a beautiful deep dive there in a way that was just so comprehensive. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And we've already got some questions coming in, which is terrific. So if I may, I'm going to read out one of the first questions that came in. Let's have a look here. Number one, does the alcohol in wine cancel out the anti-inflammatory compounds to make it pro-inflammatory?
It's a great question. I don't know, Alina, can you actually flip back to the DII slide with all the compounds and all the numbers? Because I think that would actually be awesome, because they actually do look at alcohol, and I want to say it actually has a mildly anti-inflammatory effect, but I have to double check the numbers.
I
But
think it was at the top, and I think I did see that, like minus 0.2 or
0.1,
something like
yeah,
that.
yeah,
particularly as an Australian, I was particularly
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah, so if you kind of look at alcohol, actually alcohol in and of itself has a very modestly anti-inflammatory effect. And so, you know, which is why alcohol is somewhat controversial, right? Like we see it's on the Mediterranean diet and we see that it kind of fits in very nice with the anti-inflammatory diet. So, in some respects, alcohol may be mildly anti-inflammatory, especially red wine that also has the resveratrol. The problem is that alcohol can, be a direct cell toxin and it's like a GI irritant. And so there are certain cancers and I think also dementia that do correlate. I think with breast cancer, alcohol, generally speaking, does correlate with higher risk of breast cancer and, certain GI cancers and, higher dementia risk. And so there's sort of it may be objectively anti-inflammatory, but then there are certain health conditions for which there may be other mechanisms by which it is not so favorable. So what I generally tell people about alcohol is, if you don't drink, you shouldn't start drinking because you think it's anti-inflammatory. But if you already do drink, drinking within, what, we know to be moderation, which is no more than one drink a night on average for women, and no more than 2 drinks per man, seems to be within the realm of an anti-inflammatory diet. Although, frankly, if I were at really high risk of breast cancer, if I had already had breast cancer, I would not drink.
Mm.
So, I think that it's very case specific.
Yeah, absolutely. The second part to that question from gums, fillers, additives like natural flavors, artificial sweeteners, food dyes, etc. Are they included in the DII?
So as you can see, no, they're not. And so right. So how do we understand that science? There's not a lot of great science on it. The best guidelines I use for gums and fillers and ingredients is the IOIBD guidelines, which are available through PubMed. And I think that there's no paywall. That is the International Organization for the Study of IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease. And they take whatever data is available on gums and food additives, which admittedly is not a lot. It's not a robust science yet. And they have some very specific recommendations around specific gums and emulsifiers and food additives. I think titanium dioxide, maltodextrin, carrageenan, a couple of artificial sweeteners. They kind of list out the things that we have some evidence for that suggests that they may be pro-inflammatory, again, specifically for inflammatory bowel disease risk. And advise that people avoid chronic habitual intake of those ingredients. But those are very specific ingredients. They don't treat all gums and emulsifiers the same way. I've seen some science on xanthan gum that shows that it might actually be anti-inflammatory for people with ulcerative colitis. Right. And so you can't lump all of these ingredients together just because they're in a category. Like, the body's funny, right? Like, bodies are weird and, these different things interact differently in the body. And so I don't know that you can draw sweeping conclusions about emulsifiers as a category or gums as a category. I think you really do need to look ingredient by ingredient. And the best data we have right now is from the IOIBD guidelines. I'm sure in the next decade, there's going to be a lot more coming out and we'll have much more specific guidelines around those. And I think the food manufacturers are probably going to respond to those quickly.
Fantastic. Absolutely. Great questions here. Another one, is there a minimum percentage for saturated fat? I've seen 7 to 10% in my research.
A minimum? In other words, you should have at least that much?
Yes.
I haven't seen any research that you need to have any saturated fat. So, I mean, all the research I've seen is a maximum, which is like try to keep it under, I think, 5% of calories or something.
Okay.
So no, I don't think that there's a minimum.
Yep, good question. Great. And then a wonderful comment here from Bonnie, who says, thank you, as a 67-year-old RDN for almost 45 years, who is on no prescribed meds and a coronary calcium score of 0. I'm happy to be an elder influencer. Good for you.
Yes.
Love it. Real food, desserts of dark chocolate, lots of consistent exercise for your age is the key, plus a loving relationship. Thank you for a great webinar. Love that, love that. And then others have said you're still a baby at 67. So that's awesome. I love that. Lots of big thank yous here. That's just great. What are your thoughts about saturated fat coming out of FDA recommendations?
That they're like not commenting on it in general?
Melissa, would you like to add a little bit more information there for us? Or I think what she's referring to from Nicole, she says, I think she means RFK Jr. I was hoping we could avoid, wants to remove the limit saturated fats in the DGA?
I will say that RFK Jr. generally does not abide by evidence-based recommendations.
Very beautifully said. Thank you. I think that was really great. I'm going to say that too. How do you typically approach patients who are strongly attached to misinformed beliefs and resistant to alternative perspectives? Great question, Brooklyn.
I mean, look, I think that the more that I'm emotionally invested in convincing somebody of something, the more defensive they're going to be. So what I tell people is, look, I get paid the same whether you follow my advice or not. I'm not selling anything. I don't sell a supplement. I don't sell a single thing. I have no commercial affiliations with any products or brands. So my advice is as neutral and unbiased as I think it can be. And I tell people, listen, I'm an evidence-based practitioner. I follow the science. The science doesn't support that position. If you want to continue to avoid seed oils, like you can. Like I get paid the same. I will not lose any sleep over it tonight. But you paid to see me and ask for my professional opinion. My opinion is based on the science, and this is my opinion. Eat coconut oil instead of seed oils at your own risk. You do you. Like I personally choose not to eat that way. That's not how I feed my children. This is, I mean, even before seed oils, it was with the soy. Oh, I don't eat soy. Soy is so inflammatory. Soy causes cancer. I'm like, you know what? I feed my family tofu. If I truly thought it caused cancer, I would not feed my family tofu. So I just don't get emotionally invested. Like I don't spend my time trying to convince people. If they want my opinion, I offer it. I tell them where my opinion comes from, and then I let it go.
Thank you everyone for sticking around after the Q&A. I wanted to just wrap up with a bit on how to stay connected with balance. Please feel free to screenshot this slide. Take note of our contact information in the description below. We'll be posting our main line, how to book a call with us, how to sign up for our monthly supervision groups. And here's how you can stay connected with Tamara. We'll continue learning from her expertise and have these links in the chat and description in the box below. We'll be posting the evaluation survey in the comments, and registrants will receive an email link just to how to complete that. Again, if you're not already subscribed to Balance Webinar, please do so. We give out 1 CPE credit for the Commission on Dietetic Registration every Balance Provider webinar that we actually send out those emails to. So please do stay tuned. Please join our referral network and keep engaging in resources that matter to you and to your clients. Thanks so much. Take care.
And thank you to all of you that joined us today. It was fantastic to have so many people interested in this topic. And thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.